Boker Tov. Shabbat Shalom in the room on Zoom. I have to the people on Zoom. Daniel, Beth. Who's that? Wendy, Elliot, Asher Chaim, Leslie. Oh, Brian, hi. Good morning, Shabbat Shalom.
Morning.
Good morning.
Shalom.
Great to see everybody on this frigid morning, at least here in New York City. I don't know how it is out there where you are. So a couple of things before we begin. A couple of ground rules. As usual, people can unmute themselves. And I have my little timer. At a minute. Ooh, at a minute. Wow. Everyone gets a minute.
People love that Romemu is so technologically advanced. We have an owl. We have all kinds of technology.
One of the open book students sent this to me.
I love it.
To use. So here I am using it. I have like 30 seconds. I have 1 minute.
Unbelievable. On Shabbat, there's a little bit of cold. There's a little bit of sand. I love it.
But how are you going to finish in 1 minute?
That's unbelievable.
I'm going to time Rabbi Ingber.
It's 2 minute Torah. 2 minute Torah.
A minute and a half.
It's a minute and a half. Okay. How many grains of sand go?
And I'm going to ask people to be on point. In other words, it should be related to what we're talking about.
Oh, really?
Yes, that's not obvious.
No, it's not obvious.
Because there's a lot in the Parsha. And look, Mark is clapping. And sometimes people bring up things that have nothing to do with what we're talking about.
But it's great, like in theory, because Torah is Torah.
In theory, it's great.
But like it can be.
But in practice, it's a lot to handle. So
and it's a lot, and we don't want to work that hard on Shabbat. So it's like you're not going to work on Saturday. It's like when you bring something up that's related to the beginning of the Parsha, but we're talking about the end of the Parsha, we have to do like a whole GPS, like we're like rerouting you.
So we want it to be on point. Whatever the point is, we want it to be on point. Okay, so those are the ground rules. What did we decide about the chat? It's my decision? Great. All right, we're going to leave the chat open. Have fun. Have fun. That's my decision. All right, so now we need the bracha. And I'm going to ask everybody to just recite it together. People on Zoom, stay muted, and people in the room, everyone say it out loud. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So blessed be the divine source of the universe who has sanctified us with divine commandments and commanded us to soak in divine wisdom.
Amen.
Amen. Amen. Okay, so today we are teaching Bishalach, the amazing story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. And this is in honor of Refugee Shabbat. And what Rabbi Ingber and I prepared is we talked about the hope of the refugee, right? How do you have enough hope to actually leave? And is hope required to leave? Actually required for that kind of agency? And we looked at different features in the Parsha that spoke to that question. So that's where we're going, and we're going to now screen share. Would you like to say anything else by way of introduction? Welcome.
Hey, hi. I think that I spoke a bit about this last night. For those who were in the shul last night, I spoke in my sermon about some of this, and this morning we're like unpacking, some of the things that were inspired, that led to last night's sermon, and I think a lot of it began with this wonderful poem from.
We forgot to write the name of the author, Emily Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson, exactly. Just that, an unknown.
Unknown poet, Emily Dickinson.
An unsung, unknown, obscure.
Right.
She was
unknown in her lifetime, right? But now we know her.
Right.
Tomas, do you feel like reading the poem?
I would be honored.
Great. So just do it loud so the owl can hear you.
Okay. Well, the owl also has feathers.
The owl also has
I guarantee
Well
you.
done. Well done. Well done.
We search for the poetic and the prosaic.
Exactly.
We do, or we have you to do it for us.
Hope is the thing with feathers that perches on the soul and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could abash the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb of me.
So what a beautiful image. Hope is the thing with feathers. And it's not until the second stanza that Emily Dickinson tells us, or the poet tells us, like, oh, it's a bird, right? What hope is just the thing with feathers. It's such a, just concrete image. And to think that that hope is there all the time, but doesn't need to be fed, which is the opposite of what we called our session today, feeding hope, right? So does hope need to be fed? I mean, I know that at times in me, and I assume in all of us, there's no hope to be found. Like, where's the hope? So what does it need to be able to be discerned? Let's put it that way. So that's where we're going with this next text. Okay, next text, number 2. So this is the very end of the last parsha, and it's the instructions for what will come to be known as Pesach or Passover. And it says here, "V'haya ki yishalcha vincha," shall be when your child asks you on the morrow, machar, right, on the morrow. So imagining the time that you're not in, right? They're being invited, and we're being invited, if we're imaginatively with them at this moment, to think about a different kind of moment, right? A machar, lemor, mazot, va'amarte la b'chozak yad hotzi'anu Adonai miMitzrayim miBeit avadim. So it shall be when your child asks you on the morrow, saying, what does this mean, right? Mazot, that basic question of wonderment. You are to say to them, by strength of hand, Adonai brought us out of Egypt, out of a house of serfs. So this is a remarkable commandment, because they're still in Egypt. They haven't left. And they're being asked to tell their child in the future, right, that this is what God did for me. By strength of hand, Adonai brought us out of Egypt. Crazy. So why are they being invited to imagine that moment at this moment when it hasn't yet happened? Right? They're being commanded to tell a story that hasn't yet happened. So let's go on, and we can ask that question more broadly in the room. V'hayaki hiksha paro l'shalchenu v'yaharog Adonai kol bechor be'eretz Mitzrayim bechor adam ba'ad bechor behema al ken ani zovech Adonai kol petarechem hascharim v'kol bechor banai efdeh. And it was, so here's the answer, or here's the continuation of the answer. And it was when Pharaoh hardened his heart against sending us free, that Adonai killed every firstborn throughout the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of man to the firstborn of beast. Therefore, I myself sacrificed to Adonai every breacher of a womb, the males, and every firstborn of my son I redeemed. So here is the parent explaining the ritual to their child. V'haya la'ot al yadcha u'l'totafot bein einecha ki b'chozak yad hotzi'anu Adonai miMitzrayim. It shall be for a sign on your hand and for headbands between your eyes. So this is the origin, although it's not so descriptive yet, of tefillin, right? Of tefillin, which becomes more specific and detailed in rabbinic literature. For by strength of hand, Adonai brought us out of Egypt. Okay, now here we go into the beginning of our parsha. Vayehi b'shalach paro et ha'am v'lo nicham. Lo nacham Elohim derech eretz plishtim ki karovu. Now it was when Pharaoh had sent the people free that God did not lead them by way of the land of Philistines, though it was near her. Ki amar Elohim ben yinachem ha'am bir otam milchama v'shavu mitzrayma. For God said to God's self, right? God is here thinking to God's self, and the Torah is giving us a window into that thinking. For God said, lest the people regret it when they see war and return to Egypt. Okay, so that's why they're going the long way, so that they don't regret leaving Egypt. Although they regret it again and again. So I'm not sure what God's thinking right now. Okay, anything else we want to say about this kind of background and framing?
Yeah, I think I think what moved us when thinking about this and what I think when Rabbi Kolorasis brought this up, it was really, when we think about the Exodus, when we think about the previous Parsha as a context for standing at the Sea of Reeds, at Kriyat Yam Suf, and we think about like the stages of unfolding of becoming liberated and being ready for liberation, like, you know, the preparation for liberation. Like we often think about, of course, the most important moment is the charge to kill we talked about this last week, to become the people of the door was to kill the god of Egypt and to put the blood around the doorposts and the lintels, and that was a vital moment. And yet, the Parsha, you know, the final moments before they leave Egypt are imbued with this instruction, which is remarkable. It's not actually an act, it's not foreseen, or we don't look at it as an act of courage for Moshe to say to the people, imagine that you'll have children. One day that you'll have to tell them the story. That someday, right, it doesn't feel like it right now. It doesn't feel like there's a future right now. You're terrified, you're leaving, right? But the last thing I want you to do, besides slaughtering the god of Egypt, is to do something also incredibly courageous, but remarkably important for the formation of a free people, which is to reinvest in imagining, reinvest in hoping, reinvest in the possibility that you know, not only will you be free, but you know, someday your great-great-grandchildren will live to hear this story. And so I think when you were speaking about this to me, you know, it was very touching to hear that from your perspective, and this is what emerged. It was really your chidush. I think it's your idea, is that part of what feeds hope is the ability to imagine a future that is not in any way, shape, or form obvious in the present moment.
Well, it reminds me of like you're in an emergency, right, by the side of the road and your car is stopped and you're terrified, right? Perhaps it's night, perhaps you're alone. This has never happened to me. And you know, you say to yourself, or you say to your friend, if you're with somebody or whoever, it's like, this will be a good story, right? And it's so comforting to think of yourself being in a safe, warm place.
We'll laugh at it later.
We'll laugh at it later, right? This is going to be okay. There's going to be another moment that's not like this one at all, right? And that sort of desperation to have whatever you're in be over, right? And perhaps it gave the children of Israel courage to leave, to get up and leave, because they're headed towards a future that's not like this one.
Very, very much like, reminds me of like reading the story of Sharansky and others who were in the Gulag, and you know, this it kind of very much connects to a kind of logotherapy, kind of Viktor Frankl-esque moment, that those who have a why to live for, and if the why might be the future, then they can deal with the hows.
And also, if you say it out loud,
yeah,
it'd be different, right?
Right.
As opposed to just like desperately hoping for it.
Like it's
right. Imagine it very concretely.
Very concretely, and the term makes it extremely concrete. Like v'hayayish alcha bincha macha lemor.
Right. This will happen.
Right.
It will be when this happens. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. Good. So now, Rabbi Imber brought up the story about Jim Carrey, the actor.
It's just a.
So yeah, you tell.
It was in my brain. I don't know why.
Well,
it always like I don't know which things stick in my brain from like all of us. Like, you know, where did that go? Why is that? I don't remember that. But like I remembered a story that I had read or heard somewhere about Jim Carrey, the actor. That you know, and here if you look in source 3, as again talking about Thomas, talking about the seeing the poetic in the prosaic. This is rather prosaic, but I kind of. Enjoyed it. Like he revealed, like back when he had a conversation with Oprah in 1997, that he would visualize having directors interested in him and people that he respected saying to him, "I like your work," and he would visualize things coming. He said, "I would visualize things coming to me that I wanted, and I had nothing at that time, but it just made me feel better." And so, it of course, for some of you, you know, believers in the law of attraction, practice routine visualizing techniques where they try to think of the things that they want in their life according to that philosophy. According to that philosophy, wow, just one little swipe on the mouse and you're done. So according to that philosophy, behind the techniques Focusing your mental energy on your objectives will lead to their fulfillment in the external world. And as an exercise, Carrie did something pretty remarkable. He wrote himself a $10 million check, and before he'd even achieved success, and he later buried it with his father, which was very poignant to me. And speaking of like Atzmot Yosef and everything being buried in this week's parsha, that which was buried is being dug up. Before he became a star, Carrie tried to become famous by visualizing it, but he had his doubts. At that time, all it really was for me was kind of making me feel better. I would drive home and think, well, I do have these things, they're out there. I just don't have a hold of them yet, but they're out there. And he wrote himself a $10 million check for acting services rendered. And he gave himself 5 years or 3 years maybe. I dated it Thanksgiving 1995 and put it in my wallet. I kept it there and it deteriorated and deteriorated. But then just before Thanksgiving of 1995, I found out that I was going to make $10 million on Dumb and Dumber.
But then that last line is like that last line is the most important.
It's difficult to believe that these techniques transformed Carrie into one of the world's biggest stars. When Oprah questioned him, he responded that the real key to success was hard work. Capricorn that he is, he would say that. Carrie stated, well, yeah, that's the thing. You can't just visualize and then, go eat a sandwich.
Right, but what keeps
a
you...
matzah sandwich.
Right, but what keeps you animated every day to do the hard work?
Right.
Right, so he's working towards a vision.
Right. Now, of course there is, I think that I love that he cut against the grain of his own inspirational story by and Oprah challenged him or whatever, we might challenge him and say the law of attraction is decidedly a perversion of this notion of hope having feathers, and that hope is fed through dreams, and hoping itself feeds hope, like dreaming and visualizing, right? I love that he it's not the case that you might make, that anyone who visualizes their future will, therefore have that future. That would be...
Right, you visualize you go back to bed in the morning.
Right.
It's not happening.
And sometimes and let's just be honest, sometimes people who visualize and work hard at something also, it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, for sure.
Right, and I think that we would be decidedly romanticizing this notion, but it's certainly the case that from the Torah's perspective, and from what you and I, just what this verse is, and this usage of the word machar, machar, this tomorrow, tomorrow is an amazing moment in Torah.
It is an amazing moment. And I'm wondering, when is thinking about tomorrow effective? And when does it take you out of your life that it as it is, in a way that kind of robs your life of power and meaning in the day? So now we're going to the next text, which I think responds to that question. This is text 4, that's text 7. We need text 4.
Sorry.
That's all right.
There we go.
Okay, here, you read for.
Chapter 14, verse 10. Ufaro Kriv, and Pharaoh drew near. Vayis'u b'nei Yisrael et ha'einayhem, and the Israelites lifted up their eyes. V'nei Mitzrayim noseh achrayhem, and behold, whoa, Mitzrayim is running, is traveling, they're gaining on them. Vayir'u me'od, and they became very afraid. Vayitz'aku b'nei Yisrael Adonai, and they cried out. The children of Israel, these children, just children, cry out to God.
This is really interesting. I was studying this with my chavruta this morning, Rabbi Sharon. Note how they're praying to God and then they say to Moshe. Right, there's a pivot there. We'll say more about that later. Go ahead.
Vayomru, and anybody who doesn't realize that there was humor and a sense of humor 2,500 years ago, this is Lenny Bruce or any Jewish, it's just amazing. It's it never ages. They turn to Moshe and they go, there weren't any graves in Egypt? That you took us out here into the desert to die? It's just a great line. I love that line. It's really? There are plenty of graves over there. Really? You brought us out here to die in the desert? Mazot asita lana. What did you do to us? Taking us out of Egypt.
What happened to that whole story thing? We might be sold on it, but they weren't.
They were not sold on it. Like it took only they had to do was see the Mitzrayim
Right.
running after them, and they're like, forget about the
No
kids.
hope. No hope.
No hope. It's hopeless.
We should have died in this, and they say this again and again. This is the beginning of that trope.
It's so tenuous.
Right? We should have died in Egypt.
It's so tenuous. They can barely hold on to it like a feather, right? It flies away from them, and they can't catch it. Isn't this the thing that we said to you in Egypt, saying, "Chadal mimenu, leave us alone, v'navdat Mitzrayim," and so that we can serve Egypt? Ki tov lanu avodat Mitzrayim. It is good for us to be subjugated to the Egyptians. Again, the complete misuse and I guess horrifically distorted use of the word tov in biblical jargon. Tov is the thing that is good in creation, right? They think that it's good. It makes sense. It's like it's really good, like the light of the first 6 days.
Well, it's better. It's specifically better.
It's better
to serve Mitzrayim from dying in the desert
than dying in the desert, right?
So they don't want to die. Ultimately, they just don't want to die.
Right. And being free might put the risk of being free is raising the specter that they're going to die. Freedom, right? They're not willing. And then Moshe says to people, "Don't be afraid." Like that always works when you say to people,
right. "I'm terrified. Don't be afraid."
Don't be afraid.
Right. Don't look down.
Don't look down. Exactly. Don't look down. Right. Don't look behind you. Stand strong and see the salvation of God. That will be done for you today. For as you in truth see them today. Just as you see them today, you will also, as sure as you see them today, you will also assuredly not see them going forward, which of course reminds us of the verse with Pharaoh, when Pharaoh said, "You're not to see me, if you see me again, I'll kill you." And Moshe says, "Yeah, don't worry, I'm not going to see you." And then this great line in verse 14, Adonai yilachem lachem. It's a great, also in the mouth, it's like lachem, lachem, right? God will fight for you, right? Lachem with a chet, lachem with a chaf, fighting for you. Ve'atem, and as for you, tacharishun, you shall be stand still or be quiet, right?
Or shut up.
Right?
You shut up already. Right?
Or you'll be dumbfounded, right? You'll be rendered cheresh, which means also be deaf and mute.
Yeah.
Like you'll be rendered, God's power will
Awestruck.
render you awestruck.
Yeah.
Vayomer, and that's the scene. And then the very next verse, without anything in between, Vayomer Adonai Moshe, and then God says to Moshe, Ma titzak elai. Why are you crying out to me? Or really, probably, like more accurately, why were they crying out to me? Gaber el bnei Yisrael v'sau. Speak unto the children of Israel and let them get going.
Go. Stop talking. Just go. Yeah, Tomas.
Can I ask a question of the rabbis about verse 13? Have no fear.
Yeah.
Hope and fear are brother and sister. The most.
Or at odds with one another.
Yeah, they're at odds with one another, but perhaps they also require each other, like dueling twins. But hope is as hollow as fear. Like that's the central line in the Tao Te Ching, the most solemn line. They are both illusions, and the Buddha picks up on that because they're our relationship to the future, and the future is a dream. The future is a lie. There's only here and now. So we have to beware hope. We have to beware fear. And then for me, especially coming into Judaism from Catholicism, you hear so much about the future in Catholicism, the ultimate future. You live in desperate hope of salvation and desperate fear of damnation. And it's always about this far future, which is different from eternity, which is the here and now, the Tao Te Ching would say. And when I was studying, I would ask every single rabbi about the far future, including some at this table. And they'd say, well, in Judaism, we really focus on the here and now. We do believe in the infinite life of the soul and the world to come, but we're really about the here and now. And so the warning against hope and the importance of the hollowness of hope, which I think is important. How do these traditions reconcile that with the importance of the thing with feathers and Moses saying, have no fear, which is a little bit different from saying, have hope.
Wow.
So is it okay with you that we wait until,
Oh,
yeah, so let's hold that, even though I want to be present with it and answer it in the now, but I also want to hope for the future that we're gonna come to an answer. Give me a moment. So we'll get to it when we want to get to the mana, which is, I think, in some way a response to, I think the mana story, which we'll see in a moment, in a mana moment, we're gonna come back to these two. There'll be intention with the story of the future. The mana is decidedly a story about the limiting of the future for the sake of the present and for the sake of the truth of the present. So we'll get back to, we'll come to, so in this text, yeah.
yeah. So we're going to the mana.
I mean, we can finish this text though, like this remarkable text of God and Moses in conversation about like when it's time to pray and when it's time,
Yeah.
right? So certainly one other way to give hope feathers is when one is in a position of fear. Certainly imagining a future is one antidote, and it builds and feeds hope. Another way to feed hope is also to act in the present moment, like to take an action, to take one step, and to come out of a place of limbo and knowing the tension between, let's say, spiritualizing a given moment and praying, and knowing when to enact something. Like, it's a lot of, we hear this quite frequently in American culture around gun legislation, right? And in the context of refugees, like, right, praying for the refugees is a lot different than actually setting up a way to feed them. And so we have this moment as they stand at the raging sea and they're terrified. Like, one way to convert fear is to imagine a future, right? Imagine, like, creating hope by imagining a future that isn't in the present moment. Another way also to work with fear
I don't know that actually allays fear, right? You imagine a future. It may enable you to go forward, but it may
it gives you
actually,
the courage.
it may actually intensify the fear. It just
Because
allows
now
you to
you're more
act.
invested. Because now you're more invested in
Well,
the
now you're
outcome.
more exposed as opposed to
Right.
staying still or staying in the same situation,
Right.
right? You're actually taking steps to go forward and face the fear, which is terrifying.
But you have the strength or the courage drawn from that future vision.
Yes,
Right.
exactly.
Okay, I understand. Yeah, that's a good.
There's a
point.
battling of fear and, well, it's connected to what Hamas said.
Right.
Fear and hope.
Fear and hope.
There's a battle in that case.
So as a stratagem for like hope is a stratagem, and you're feeding hope, you're also feeding your capacity to act in the world.
Yes, exactly.
And then here in this moment, also like coming out of the Israelites' now abandonment of their hope and their fear kind of comes to the fore, and God says, okay, now another method is like, get going.
Yeah.
Like, again, it's almost like you fed your hope, you fed your vision, but now you have to go in and you have to go on that interview, or whatever it is,
Right.
it's something banal.
Right. It's like what Carrie
go.
said, you have to just work.
You have to
just have to
actually
do
work.
it. Right.
So it comes to the fore in this conversation with God, where God says to Moses out of nowhere, why are you praying to me? And there is no indication from the text that Moshe is praying to God, right? It's kind of, there's an ellipsis there. And so the rabbis of the Talmud in source number 5 say, Limdanu shaya Moshe omedu mitpalel. This teaches us, God's interrogation of Moshe teaches us that although the text does not explicitly say Moshe was standing in prayer, Moshe had said to the people to not be afraid, right? You'll stand here and be quieted in awe of God's power. But then Moshe went into prayer mode. Like, they're praying to God, and Moshe says, okay, let me quiet them, but I'll turn to God and I'll start praying too. And God says, everybody should stop praying, right? Let's get going, right? Now is not the time to be lengthening your prayers, right? Everybody is feeling very narrow and very squeezed. Pick up and go, right? Ein lahem, Rashi says in source number 6, Ein lahem ela lisa. They have nothing left to do but trust and go forward, right? And the faith that they had in me and the merit of their ancestors will stand with them, and they just need to go. Now, that's all, that still doesn't work. And in one source here that we brought later on, which if you look, I guess if we go to that source, which is source number
Talking about the Banshee-Law?
No, not shown.
Oh, not shown. Got it.
Source number not shown, which is source 10. Yeah. So we're on page 10, source number 10. People know this story. Right? Rabbi Meir said, when the Jewish people stood at the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, the tribes were arguing with one another. This one was saying, I'm going into the sea first, and that one was saying, I'm gonna go in, right? That's one, right? That's one, you should have the smaller one, but okay. That's one approach, and then, no, that's not the one. Where is it? I'm sorry, one second.
Towards the end.
Oh, I'm sorry, towards the end, excuse me. So go towards the end, here it is.
Yeah,
Right
this is
here.
how the incident, right?
Right. Rabbi Yehuda said to Rabbi Meir, so this is the famous midrash that all of us are familiar with. That's not how the incident took place. In other words, I'm sorry that we jumped over, but in the previous story, Rabbi Meir had one way of understanding what took place at the Sea of Reeds, and Rabbi Yehuda corrects him and says, no, they were not each trying to say, I'm gonna go in first. They were saying the opposite. Every tribe was saying, no way, you go first, right? Now I'm not going in, you go in, you know? Like, it wasn't nearly as heroic as you imagine it, Rabbi Meir. Like, Rabbi Yehuda says, no. That's not how it went down. They were terrified. And then the prince of Judah, Nachshon ben Aminadav, he went in first, right? And so we have the story of this heroic individual, right? After it's all fine and good for Moshe to say to the people, let's all hang out, and watch God. And then Moshe gets busy crying, and God says, just get him going. And Moshe's like, okay, let me just tell him to get going. And it doesn't happen. But in the second version, kind of like hope is born from radically courageous individuals who, when seeing people afraid, show them what's possible. It's the Rosa Parks, right?
There's another version of the Midrash where the sea doesn't part until he walks in further and further and further into the sea, until he gets to his nostrils, and that's when the sea opens. Right, so there's something about his agency or his courage that actually allows God to split the sea.
It's like there are people when all hope seems lost, or when people have done all their imaginings, and then like a Herzl steps forward and imagines, right, some kind of, imagines us in our non-exilic reality, back in our indigenous land, or a Rosa Parks, or an amazingly courageous leader who stands out and says, you know what, right, people are going down the fear road again, and I have to reinvigorate them by making a radical stand, because hoping is, all hope seems to be like imagining hasn't worked, and telling them to get going hasn't worked, and someone says, let's get going.
Right.
Let's
just go. The power of that line. Just go.
So I feel like we should open up, but I also feel like we really we're about to come back to the mana and back to Tomas's question, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think we have time. Let's open up for a little while.
Open up a little while and
then
come
we'll
back.
Come back
Okay,
to the
great.
mana. So I've got my trusty 1 minute. Okay, Jeffrey in the room.
I'm reminded, I think it was John McCain who talked about the difference between prisoners of war that were in terrible conditions for years and years and years. The difference between those that made it out and those that didn't. Ironically, it's exactly the opposite. It's those that expected, that were like, we're gonna be out by New Year's. We're gonna be out by Christmas. I know we're gonna be out. And they didn't get out. Those are the ones that actually never made it out. And it was the ones that had no expectation, that just lived every day as it was. That being in the moment that actually survived.
So who weren't imagining like one day this will be a good story. It's exactly, wow. So where does that leave us? Right, let's, I think, again, the Mana story will help us maybe understand the difference. Okay, Jay.
This seems to be a good time to remember my grandfather, my
Jay, we
opa.
don't hear you. You have to unmute.
Oh, I am.
You can't
don't
unmute?
hear me?
Unmuted. He's unmuted, but maybe this. Can somebody Gil? Can
We
you
hear
speak in, see if
we
the
hear
owl's
him.
working?
We hear him.
Yeah, I can hear him well.
Maybe the owl's not on. There's a.
It seems like you've gone silent now.
Yeah, now the room is muted.
Yeah.
Oh, you know what? Maybe they can't hear.
Can you
I
hear me
wonder if
now?
they can hear any of us.
All right. I feel like I'm in that cell phone commercial. This is very short. Just seems like a good time to remember my grandfather, my opa, who used to say, "Tachlis" means talk less.
Oh, wow.
Great, thank you.
All right, and with that, you're done. I love that.
I love it, I love it.
You modeled it, you taught it, it was perfect.
Perfect. Who's the
Perfectly
corner there?
done.
I can't see who that is.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so Ilana has her hand up.
Alana. Alana Schneier? Is that Alana?
Hi, Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
I was thinking of the frame of leaving with hope versus just leaving in that sort of last command of like, just get going. You got to go. There's no thinking about this. And when my grandmother left Vienna, there was, when my aunt asked her, like, why did you leave? Like, what got you to leave? She sort of said, there was just nothing left for us. And so I don't know that that's a hopeful act, but just kind of like, when there is nothing left there for you, when you cannot imagine a future or hope for a future where you are, then you go. But and maybe inherent in that is some hope, but I don't know. There's also something of like, this is not tenable anymore, which I don't know if that equates to hope. And I don't know if that, like the Israelites are all enslaved and whatever. And so there's nothing here, and then maybe that also explains on the other side of like, where did you bring us to? Like, we knew that and it was horrible and we decided to go, but now it's this other scary frontier.
It's another scary, right? So when is desperation the driver and when is hope the driver? And desperation feels like a very real sort of motivation or something that sort of animates you to leave, right? And when you think of refugees, for sure. So I think the question is it worth, are you so desperate that you're going to risk death? And I think the answer is often yes, right? We're so desperate. But the Israelites, when they say, oh, weren't there enough graves in Egypt? They're like, no, we're not that desperate. We rather would have stayed in Egypt. So it's interesting because not everybody leaves. Not everybody's desperation drives them out.
It's also the case that in the moment, like I think it's really fanciful in the moment when the Israelites, I don't really believe that, I think it's a distortion. It's not just like that they're devaluing freedom over Egypt. I think death was happening in Egypt too. And something about the moment's pain allows them to romanticize and distort what was taking place in Egypt, right? So, it's not exactly as though, death was a sure thing in Egypt too in certain ways. I mean, it wasn't as though they were living without that specter.
So maybe it's really the expanse, this newly found expansiveness that they can't take. That it's not about death, right? At all. Right? It's a kind of emotional death.
It's an emotional, it could be an emotional death. I mean, let's just think about it. The number of presumably there were about 3 million Israelites who were leaving. 600,000, men and 3 million humans were on the way with cattle and everything. And the number of Pharaoh's phalanx was something like 300 horsemen. Just think about like the distortion and where they were in terms of what, it's just pretty remarkable just to see that they couldn't imagine any other reality.
Right, it speaks to the imagination of themselves.
And they were armed.
And
they were armed. Right. They come out of Egypt armed.
Right.
They come out of Egypt, they're armed. They're they overpowered the Egyptians by, by some absurd order of magnitude. And yet their mentality was such that they couldn't imagine killing their oppressors. It's really a remarkable moment also on every level. But I think that Roberta.
Yeah, Roberta.
Yeah, thank you. Shabbat Shalom. I'm super drawn to what Ilana raised, but it's not what I was going to share. It's just about what Ilana raised, that finding, it's such a path to non-duality, which is finding hope in the place where there is no hope. And that is really what the teachings are saying, right? That, knowing what's hidden and knowing what's hidden in the hidden. And so I think that's a beautiful exploration. But what I wanted to share is I've been sitting here looking at when have I had hope? And it's really when I surround myself with people who are contributing in the world. When I surround myself with people who are acting as if they have hope. Particularly, you know, I spent 10 years in the West Bank. People probably know this. And I would come back hopeful. You know, I'd go back to my family and friends in Israel and they'd be like, what? How could you be hopeful? I'm like, because I'm with Palestinians and Israelis who are hopeful. I mean, I really experienced that. And just to finish my 1 minute.
Time is up.
Okay. Yeah. So that's it. And well, just it gave me a new understanding of the problem with the fourth son in the Seder who puts himself outside of the people, that when you're outside the people who are acting as if they have hope, it's very hard for you to have hope.
Beautiful. Thank you.
And hope generates our whole story.
Thank you. Liliana. We're going to go back. Okay. We'll take 2 more comments and we're going to go back to the text.
Okay, I'm just living this parsha with such an intensity because I live my own life. I had my terrible, my experience when I had to leave my country in Argentina when we were like Jews. We were afraid to live by Jews because it was the junta and the situation was so terrible. But my situation was, I said I had to leave. I really didn't, I don't know if I had hope. I just had to, it's like Moshe said, or like God said to Moshe, don't cry to me, just go, just let go. And I had in my life that I was married with 4 children. One was a little baby that it wasn't even 1 year old. And my husband was 50 years old without knowing English, coming to this country. And did we have hope? I don't know. We were just scared. Very scared because I did have hope, but it was the hope and the unknown, what was going to happen. And I feel so myself as the refugees right now, that it's so hard to face and to live that situation. And that's why for me, this parsha is so meaningful in my life. But you know, it pushed me to do it. I said, I did what God said, just go. Wow. Close your eyes and go because you have to do it.
Wow. Liliana, thank you. I think you really just manifested and illustrated what Ilana said. It's like, it's just like desperation and you just go, right? Maybe hope is sort of how we imagine things, but it's really not that way. Yeah, it sounds like it was more immediate for you. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I think we're going to go back to the text and then we'll come back to, hopefully we'll have time for people who've been waiting to say something. We're going to the manna, which is, let's see, it is text number
11, isn't it?
Right here.
text number 7. Yeah, okay. All right, so what happens after the Israelites cross through the sea is really interesting because there they are at the sea singing victoriously, and as soon as they get to the other side, they're crying for water, right? And they think they're gonna die in the desert. And then after they cry, because they don't have enough water, which God gives them, or God gives Moshe something that sweetens the water, they cry because they're hungry. So it's this very short, brief moments of victory and feeling like they've been released and they've been freed. And then they just become, you can almost imagine a crying infant after they're born, like, wow, wow, we're thirsty, wow, wow, we're hungry. And this is all like happens before Sinai. So God is instructing them in very visceral ways through water and through food, almost as a parent instructs an infant, right? It's not time yet for language, right? Language, Sinai is all about language. This is, I mean, there's language involved, but it's really a pre-language lesson and instruction. So let's look at that. Exodus 16, Vayis'u me'elim v'yavo kol adat b'nei Yisrael el midbar Sin asher bein Elim uven Sinai. So setting out from Elim, the whole Israelite community came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. Chamisha asar yom lachodesh hasheni v'tzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim, which is the 15th day of the second month after their leaving Egypt. Vayilonu kol adat b'nei Yisrael al Moshe al Aharon bamidbar. So in the wilderness, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moshe and Aaron. And again, it's that continuation of the trope that we just saw a little while ago. You know, the grumbling, the complaining, the fear of death. Vayomru elehem b'nei Yisrael mi yiteinu biyad Adonai be'eretz Mitzrayim b'shivteinu al sir habasar ba'ochlenu lechem l'svoa ki hotzeitem otanu el hamidbar hazeh la'amit et kol hakahal hazeh b'rav. So again, it's that terrified, complaining voice the Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the hand of Adonai in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, when we ate our fill of bread, but you have brought us out into this wilderness to starve this whole congregation
Makes me hungry, I wanna get a ruggle.
to death.
If only we had rugalach in the desert.
So that sort of abject, like primal fear, like they're just in that fear and they can't see anything else, even though they just witnessed all those plagues and they just walked through a split sea. And there's no memory and there's no imagination, right? There's no looking backwards and there's no looking forwards in a way that feels connected to reality. Vayomer Adonai Moshe, Hineni mamtir lachem min hashamayim v'yatsa ha'am v'laktu devar yom b'yomo l'ma'an anasenu hayelech b'torati im lo. So God doesn't respond directly except with a plan, right? Here's the plan. Adonai said to Moshe, I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people should go out and gather each day that day's portion. So that's interesting, that combination of raining bread and the people needing to collect it, that I may thus test them to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. So let's see, what do they do? V'haya bayom hashishi v'hachinu et asher yaviu v'haya mishneh al asher yilketu yom yom. On the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day. So on the sixth day they get double, and this is in preparation for the concept of Shabbat, which, if you remember, was first mentioned, and the only time it's mentioned before here is in Genesis, and that's really about God's relationship to God's self. Like, I will rest on the seventh day. So, Vayomer Moshe V'Aaron Kol B'nei Yisrael Erev B'Yadatem Ki Adonai Hotzi Echem Me'eretz Mitzrayim. So Moshe and Aaron say to the Israelites, by evening you shall know it was Adonai who brought you out from the land of Egypt. So somehow this instruction of manna will teach them the reality of the fact that God had just brought them out of Egypt. Uvoker ureitem et kvod Adonai v'sham'o et tlunotechem al Adonai v'nachnu ma ki talinu aleinu. And in the morning you shall behold the presence of Adonai, Because God has heard your grumblings against Adonai. For who are we that you should grumble against us? What? Go to the end, okay. So we're gonna skip because it's long. And what verse are you in?
Just like, so this is like the description of the manna comes to Moshe and Aaron twice. So essentially it comes as like God gives over this direction, and then it'll come again in much greater detail, and then it'll finally arrive. And its arrival is verse 13 and 14, and it's kind of what it looks like. It's covering the camp, and it's like dew. And then we pick up in verse 15, where the people of Israel the children of Israel see the manna, and then, then more happens.
Yeah, okay. Vayir'u b'nei Yisrael in 15, vayomru ish el achiv manhu. So when the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, "What is it?" It's like such it's such an interesting play on the manna. It's not mahu, it's manhu. Ki lo yad'u mahu, because they didn't know what it was. It's a funny little textual note. Why did they ask that? Because they didn't know what it was. Even though they were just told what it was, right? But I guess the actual encounter with this sort of miraculous reality of manna led them to say like, manhu. Vayomer Moshe alehem, hu alachem asher natan Adonai lachem la'ochla. So it is the bread, Moshe told them, that God gave to you to eat. And then 16, Zeh hadavar asher siva Adonai l'ktu mimenu ish lefi ochlo. Such a beautiful line. This is what God has commanded, Adonai has commanded. Each household shall gather as much as it requires to eat, and omer to a person. For as many of you as there are, each household shall fetch according to those in its tent. I'm sorry, I skipped la'ochla. I'm sorry. I skipped hu alechem asher natan Adonai lachem la'ochla. So God has given you this to eat, and each person should collect it according to what they need to eat. So it's very individual, like it's very responsive to individual need and hunger. Okay, vayasu ken b'nei Yisrael vayilketu hamarbeh v'hamamit. 17, the Israelites did so, some gathering much, some little. Okay, do you think we should go on with this?
Yeah,
Here?
I'll just go, so let me, so just to get to the part, so generally there's a gathering of the manna, right? But then verse 20 tells us, and this is where we're getting, we should start here, V'lo shamu el Moshe, but they didn't listen to Moshe. Some people took too much, right? And they left over until the morning, and they found out when they woke up in the morning that this was not something that you could leave until the next day. Right, tomorrow was not something that manna was attuned to. In other words, manna was the bread for today. It was today's bread, le pain quotidien.
You can't afford manna.
It's bread today. It's not for tomorrow. In fact, if you try to leave it for tomorrow, guess what happens? It's ruined. Worms grow in it, right? It becomes ruined. It's inedible. So it's like you gather it in the morning. It's for you for the day, and then. Right, and then you have to make sure that you don't leave over tomorrow, because as we were talking about this, it's the exact antithesis of what the matzah is for slaves. One of the reasons why we eat matzah is because it reminds us of our freedom. It's the bread of freedom, because we ran out right before it could bake in full. But another reason Ibn Ezra brings it and other people bring this is because when you're a refugee or you're a poor person, you get something as thick as matzah, you eat a piece. And like we do with the afikomen, you take the rest of it and you put it on the side for tomorrow. Because you don't know what tomorrow will bring. And so you're always thinking about tomorrow. And it becomes the antithesis of hope. It's hopelessness. It's I don't believe and trust in tomorrow, so I better plan today for tomorrow. And today becomes a means to the end, which is tomorrow.
Which leads you to hoard.
Which leads you to hoard. It leads you to hold on. Fear. It's a fear mentality. Like you hoard in, you say, you know what? I don't know what tomorrow will bring. I better make sure that I have enough. And so it's the antithetical response to Dayenu, enough. It's I don't have enough. And so matzah paradoxically holds both of those truths, but mana doesn't. Mana is explicitly today. It's not tomorrow. Tomorrow is its kryptonite, right? Vayomar layam, but then here's an amazing thing. Except what's the exception to that rule? Shabbat. Vayomar layam in verse 23. If you look at verse 23, right? Who Asher Diber Adonai? Because I'm sorry, in verse 22, Moshe repeats the instruction that came earlier in the text, where he said that you can take double the portion on Shabbat, which now is leading to the custom that we have of having 2 loaves of bread for every one of the 3 meals of Shabbat. Right? We always have to have 2 full loaves. It's because of the manna, to remind us that we had a double portion, right, on Friday for Shabbat. So Vayomar Lehem, Hu Asher Diber Adonai, Shabbat Shabbaton, Shabbat Kodesh Adonai, Machar, tomorrow. Right, tomorrow. The only other instance in the book of Exodus where the word tomorrow appears, it appeared tomorrow in the beginning of our text study this morning, where Kish Alcha Bincha Machar lay more, that when your child will ask you tomorrow, which is hope, Tomas, hope for a slave. And I would argue, to answer your question, I would say that Judaism is, to the extent that I understand Buddhism enough, I don't know the fullness of Buddhism. And I would say that the Tao Te Ching and the Buddha would, I wouldn't necessarily say that hope is anathema to both of those traditions, but I would say that Judaism balances between the recognition that tomorrow and history itself, right, or the version of history, that there is linearity to history and not circularity, is one of the chidushim, one of the novel ideas that Judaism introduced to the world, is this notion of an eschaton, a notion of that there is a place to go to, a promised land, there is a temporal dimension that will be better than. And that actually makes its way into American culture, it makes its way into movies, it makes its way into like every kind of notion that human beings might think of tomorrow, and using their imaginal space to go forward in time is part of the Jewish perspective. But there's also recognition, and certainly it's borne out by the Mana, and it's certainly borne out in the mystical traditions of Judaism, back to non-duality and Roberta, which is, of course, we only have this moment. Even all future projections are happening within this moment. Right? We're not actually leaving this moment when we imagine the future. We're projecting ourselves from this future forward. And so in a mystical universe, there is, of course, only now, and there is, of course, only ever now, truly. And so in this way, the mana becomes almost like 6 days a week, you have to be present in your reality. You have to limit your expectations and your hopes. But 1/7 of your life, right? 1 small percent of your life should be future-oriented towards a vision of a world that you're working towards, and not, right? That's where, right, like social activist Buddhism imagines a better world. And it's not only rooted in the present experience, but it imagines even those who stay in the present moment are doing it in order to live more skillfully. And that itself is born from a mind that can project itself out of the present conditions, right? The Buddha's own innovations were to say that you can imagine a world, right, where suffering doesn't exist, and that's certainly not the present moment, where suffering is rampant. So like this is kind of our vision was like mana is the place where today and tomorrow are held in a balance between hoping and giving feathers, right, those place, and where too much of that, too much hope, too much expectation can actually be its own source of suffering in a way.
Which goes back to Jeffrey's point about, if you expect to get out of jail, even though there's no signs that you're gonna get out of jail in 6 months, and you don't, then you start to sort of, decompose in a sense. But if you have the kind of hope that can stay with the moment and the reality of the moment, maybe that's what sustains you. And even if you think about the mana of the day, Moshe said to the people, you will know by this mana that God took you out of Egypt. So there's something about that presence of mana, even though it's so concrete and visceral, that helps you understand the bigger picture. And I'm definitely not a Buddhist in the sense that I feel like even though we're grounded, even though I came down from a 7-day silent retreat, that I think there's something about the now in which you find the past and the future. Like there is no real human consciousness without having some sense of a past and a future. Or maybe there's something I'm not understanding about how to eliminate those two. There's probably something I don't get. But even Thich Nhat Hanh talks a lot about finding your ancestors in the moment. So it doesn't seem like the past is eliminated or the future is eliminated in that sense.
Well, there is this lovely concession in the text at the end. That, yes, the mana is by definition about today, and it's ephemeral, and it has a special relationship to Shabbat. But also, we're going to like put one Omer in a jar, and that's going to last for all the ages.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like
exactly.
beautiful anomaly.
I once told my students that it was in a museum in Israel, at the Israel Museum. They actually believed me that it was still there.
I believe you.
It's like, yeah, there's a piece of mana. It's in the Israel. You can go see it. It's still there for the ages.
But it's such a, I love that, but I love the image of a jar of that thing, which was, the Torah tells
Which
us,
can't even last till tomorrow.
can last till tomorrow,
It can last through the ages.
can last through the ages.
It's
Like,
crazy.
if
Right.
there's ever
It
an
makes-
experience of hope and like something that is like the gift of grace, like if you have it's some visceral image of what grace might be, it's raining, that grace and nourishment rains down for free from heaven. It's something that you can't put away, as it were. You have to live in grace each day, go out and gather it in. But that there is
Oh my God, I'm about to come. Oh.
Okay. It's really, so Shabbat, Shabbat is a day. One second, I'll just like take that in for a second. Like the
It does feel like the space has been desecrated in some way.
So I just want to say, we pray for a day. It's just a real, it's really, I feel like it's a sacred actually interruption, because in some sense it reminds us that even within our own, in this space which becomes hallowed for the sake of eternity, it's a way that, Rav Kook wrote that you have to always daven in a room with windows in it, and we're actually learning in a room with windows. Because there is a need to bridge the world as we hope it to be. And again, here comes hope again. And unfortunately, the distance, the pa'ar, the distance between the beauty of this sacred container and the realities of, unfortunately, billions of people in the world who are either distorted by their own ignorance or the ignorance of other people, who feel the need to desecrate other people's sacred containers with their own foolishness and their own hunger in some way, and their own hurt. And so we just lift up whoever that was, just lift up that person and all of the people who are like-mindedly seeking spaces that in some way will nourish this distorted perversion that they have. That Hashem should heal that place in them. It says in this week's Torah portion that Ani Adonai Rofecha, all of the disease that I put in Egypt, I won't put on you because I'm your God, your healer. So the Torah, seeks a world of healing. And if ever we needed a proof that there's a future vision that we need to inform our present moment with, it was that, right? A world where that doesn't happen. And that's a benign form of what happens each and every day to children and to women around this world. And, it's just, and to refugees who are so vulnerable and exposed, and whose hope is day to day. And it's just a remarkable reminder of how much work there is to do.
Amen.
So I'm sorry for that. Yeah. So I think that I'm so happy that we got a chance to talk about the mana and Tomas's question really focused it in such a beautiful way for us on that feather piece, because I think that the last thing that we wanted to tell you about today, and friends online as well, is that this is a special
Feeding
Shabbat.
the birds.
So this Shabbat is called Shabbat Shira, the Shabbat of the song. And there is a custom that is an Ashkenazi custom that already, according to Rabbi David Lincoln from JTS and scholar of Jewish law and Jewish customs, he writes very beautifully that whenever you have more than a couple of reasons for a custom's existence, you know that the custom existed before the reasons were given, right? He says that's his general rule. And he says there are at least 5, and we added a couple of our own, at least 5 reasons given for a custom that is prevalent in Ashkenazi Germanic lands. That on the Shabbat of the Song of the Sea, which is
It's
the
the
Shabbat.
last text, if you want to look at it, number 11.
The Shabbat of the Song of the Sea is, the Shabbat of the Song of the Sea, there was a custom in Ashkenazi lands to feed birds. And in fact, I did research, I remember doing research on this a couple of years ago, where there actually was a custom in certain Ashkenazi lands to bake challahs in the shape of birds.
Oh, wow.
Little bird challahs. Little bird challahs. And so when we were doing this text, explanation, and Rabbi Kaleres brought this incredible poem from Emily Dickinson that was in her heart, and I just remembered that it happens to be the highest, and Refugee Shabbat this year coincides with Shabbat of the birds. And this hope has feathers, right? Is the thing with feathers. And the custom was because apparently the birds sang songs when we were freed. And so we feed them as a way of thanking them, right? And what a beautiful image to feed birds on, who sang songs, the song of hope, the song of, and so a couple of those, reasons are in source number 11, right? I like that. I think the Chasam Sofer has one in here, right? In order, right? It says, in order, it says, right, in order that they have bread, that they see the bread which I fed you, that the feed the birds on Shabbat Shira, in order to say to the Jewish people, who are compared to a bird, will devote themselves to Torah mitzvot, then God will provide them food without toil. Okay, a lot of different answers, but we had one also, which was this week, which was the Torah of hope. That feeding the birds on Shabbat Shira is a way of saying that hope is the thing with feathers. And that, even if Emily Dickinson says that she didn't need to feed it, which meant that it was alive and well, even without being nourished.
Never in extremity, it asked a crumb of me.
Wow.
So, yeah, it exists in a way that doesn't depend on what we give it. Although I don't feel like that, to come back to the beginning, I don't feel like that's true.
Right.
I feel like
But the mana is that.
hope really needs to be nurtured, and that we become hopeless so easily. And maybe it's always there, but I don't know how to connect to it.
But that's what Roberta was saying. Like Roberta was saying that what fed her hope was what gave her
Other
hope.
people.
Were there other people who had hope, or seeing that there is, seeing an example of your own capacity to be reborn, like another bird that burns and is ever alive in us.
Well, it's nice that you feed a bird seed, because seed is another encapsulation of hope, like the coriander seed that mana tastes like.
Beautiful.
So hope is feeding hope, right?
Hope is feeding hope.
So mana is that ultimate expression of hope. Because mana comes both in, as she said, without having to feed it, it feeds us. We don't have to feed it. But at the same time, it also reminds us, as you said, like that if we stay with it and we also imagine it comes. Anyways, there's a lot for us to be nourished by in this text. We hope that it was
We hope
that it was, potpourri of
we
different
hope
sources.
it nourished your hope.
Definitely.
Thank you, Gil, for being so dexterous and skillful in keeping this.
Sorry about that.
No, you don't have to apologize. But you did nothing wrong. We did nothing wrong.
No.
And that's often what happens when something like that happens, that we feel as though something like, we just have rahmanas for that person. We have compassion for that person and for us also. And we come back to the beautiful space that we were in. The Torah can never, ever be contaminated. The Torah can never, ever be contaminated. You can drop a dead body, God forbid, on a Sefer Torah, and it stays a Sefer Torah. And we always come back to the Torah because it's like a mikveh. We learn Torah together.
Mikveh Israel, right?
Mikveh, it's like
Israel.
it immerses us. So it's like, they come into the spaces, people come into our spaces through 2,000 years and try to desecrate it. And we ourselves are the people of hope and the people of, we ever rise from these places. And so we just continue to build a good world and surround ourselves with good people and do the good work to make the world a better place. That's what we do, right? So. All right, everybody, good Shabbos, good Shabbos, Shabbos Shira.
See you in
Shabbos
services.
Shira.
God.
Shalom.
Wonderful.
Great thing.
I was gonna say that it's me.